look, if Democrats don't take back the House of Representatives next year, then it is a 5-alarm fire in the Democratic Party.
What if the just completed 2025 elections offered encouraging hints about the direction of our country and our region? What if 2026 is the year when the stakes are going to be really high and when things will get really clear? I'm Greg Amrafel, and this is Pacific Time. We're trying something new to explore the big questions about the election, past and future. It's a compilation episode. I'm joined by 3 sharp and distinctly West Coast voices, all returning friends of the podcast. We've got political strategist Sandeep Kaushik, Pulitzer Prize-winning political cartoonist Mark Fiore, and comparative elections expert Ashley Brown. They offer perspectives to help make sense of what just happened and what's coming next. The 2025 elections delivered shockwaves. Democratic socialist Zohran Mamdani defeated Andrew Cuomo to be mayor of New York City. Socialist Katie Wilson came out of nowhere in Seattle to win the mayor's race and beat incumbent Bruce Harrell by less than 2,000 votes. Centrist Democrats with national security chops won big in New Jersey and the Virginia governor's races. And a landslide victory for Prop 50 in California, enabling Democrats to redraw their congressional maps and respond to election rigging in Texas. Each guest is going to answer the same questions. What surprised them in recent elections nationally and locally? What signals they're watching for next year across the country and on the West Coast? And what their dreams and nightmare scenarios are for where the country and our region are going now. It's a lively, alarming, and surprisingly hopeful set of conversations about a country on the brink and why the West Coast has a unique role to play in shaping what comes next. Before we dive in, note that over the coming week, you can watch clips from our guests on YouTube at Pacific Time Podcast. Please subscribe, like, and comment with your own take on each of the questions. I started by asking our guests what most surprised you about the 2025 elections nationally or locally. Sandeep Kaushik, political consultant and co-host of the podcasts Blue City Blues and Seattle Nice, got it started.
Maybe the biggest surprise is that the roiling debate that has been going on within the Democratic Party since last November's election, which was obviously a searing defeat, Trump getting reelected, and not just getting reelected, but winning a plurality of the popular vote, winning all the swing states, seeing huge demographic shifts in key constituencies moving towards Trump. All of that stuff has been a pretty big wake-up call for the party. And so there's been a roiling debate about how to respond to that and which way to go. And if anybody was looking for some kind of resolution to come out of this November's election to that debate, they are sorely disappointed. If anything, I think the debate is even more likely to intensify even more as we go forward, because there's a lot of ammo here for whichever side of that debate you happen to be on, whether it's Zohran Mamdani's very kind of spectacular victory in New York City as a Democratic socialist coming out of nowhere to defeat a scion of the Democratic establishment and Andrew Cuomo, though a scandal-tainted one running a terrible campaign, but nonetheless, certainly that would have been seen as a huge upset 6 or 8 months ago. Or, here in Seattle, Katie Wilson is maybe on the cusp of ousting our incumbent mayor. She herself, a young, in her early 40s, self-proclaimed socialist activist with no government experience who got significantly outspent. That seems to be, at least in blue cities around America, this socialist turn seems to be a real rising political force. On the other hand, in the 2 big gubernatorial races this fall in New Jersey and Virginia, you have Democrats of a very different stripe winning big. Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey, a former Navy helicopter pilot, Abigail Spanberger, who worked at the CIA, both of them running very overtly centrist campaigns, right? So anyway, that debate in the Democratic Party is at full boil, and it's going to continue to be for the foreseeable future, as far as I can tell. There's nothing coming. I thought maybe there'd be some more clarity somewhere around this coming out of this election. We didn't see that.
Mark Fiore, political cartoonist and digital media innovator, chimes in next about what surprised him.
I guess I'm not going to say this is what most surprised me about the entire election. I mean, I was very happy with what happened, that it was a real pushback against the Trump mayhem. But I think what most pleasantly surprised me was watching that acceptance speech by Mamdani. It was so amazing. With two young children, we were keeping an eye on what was happening and doing what I do for a living. I wanted to find out what was going on. And so we turned on the TV like just in time to see his acceptance speech. And it was so refreshing to see someone really push back strong and hard against Trump and what's going on currently, and not to, no quibbling, no Schumer parsing, no strongly worded letter, nothing like that. Like, it was full bore. At times it was very Obama-esque, but it was like Obama with a little more, sharpened pencil or knife or pen or whatever you want to call it, where it really had some good power to it. So that was honestly a very pleasant surprise to see that. I was surprised how many people out here were paying attention to that and talking about it. Sure, it's a New York thing, but it's clearly national. It's clearly national to see that happening. I really think one of the things that stood out about him and his speech was that he addressed Trump head on. It's like, obviously he talked about issues that matter to New Yorkers, and he's not, he wasn't running against Trump, but obviously he's got a huge target on his back and on his front when it comes to Trump. So that was the part that really stood out to me. It's like, obviously, affordability and buses that run on time and are free and all of the other things that he was talking about, that's great. And that's what you want to hear from a mayor, good, strong local things. That's important. It was the turn up the volume, old man. It was essentially that, which was great.
And then Ashley Brown, marketer and political commentator, had this to say about what surprised him in this election.
Nationally, the similarities between the elections in New Jersey and Virginia I thought were really interesting. So obviously this was Chattarelli's second run for the governorship of New Jersey. He lost by, I think, about 2.5 points to Murphy 4 years ago. He, most people believe, ran a very disciplined, excellent campaign against Mikey Sherrill, who many perceive to have also been a somewhat weaker candidate. And she trounced him by, I think, a margin no one would have expected. I mean, double digits in that race. But what was interesting to me is to juxtapose that with Virginia, where Winsome Earle-Sears ran what many people consider to be a terrible campaign against Abigail Spanberger, who most people believe was an excellent, high-quality candidate. And the margins in that race were about the same as New Jersey. So what I take away from that I think is interesting is that candidate quality actually didn't seem to matter in those two races in 2025, that it was genuinely a wave year that just washed over the candidates.
And put that a different way. A wave year meaning that this was simply an up-down vote on whether you believe in Donald Trump and Republicans or the Democratic alternatives.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you could see it in the campaigns and how they both were very nationalized. I've got to think that there was really clear polling that was the direction the races were moving.
What's your take on Zohran Mamdani's win in New York and what that means for us on the West Coast?
It's interesting. There's a lot of agita, I think, particularly on the right, about Mamdani's win. I don't think it's as national as some people think. I mean, the mayoralty of New York is a very specific role. Mamdani is a very specific candidate. He ran, very much a non-nationalized race. It was very focused on affordability and housing and transportation and issues that New Yorkers care about. So I think it's hard to take a New York race and draw national implications from it. However, that said, Katie Wilson in our hometown, who proudly owns being a socialist, also narrowly won. So I think what it does say is that in Democratic politics, there is definitely a lane for people who identify as socialists, and in jurisdictions, those people can win.
We've not talked about maybe the biggest election result on the West Coast, which was Prop 50 in California. So Ashley, first of all, could you explain Prop 50 as someone who has a keen eye for election system reform? And B, what did you find surprising about that outcome?
Yeah, so California has an independent redistricting commission, which, as you know, I love, that was put in place by a voter mandate. And what Prop 50 does, it was introduced by Gavin Newsom in response to the Texas effort to gerrymander their congressional districts at Donald Trump's behest. Prop 50 would suspend that independent redistricting commission for 2 election cycles and allow California to politically redraw, I should say, their congressional map to eliminate a handful of Republican and Republican-leaning districts. I think the number is 4, if memory serves. And it passed overwhelmingly.
Yeah, it was a landslide, I think, by 20% at least.
That's right.
What, if anything, surprised you about that outcome?
I wasn't surprised at all about that outcome. I think that Newsom played it expertly. He was also very smart in going to the voters. He can now say that he has a popular mandate to do this. The outcome of the election broadly mirrors the partisan split of the California electorate. And you even saw that, based on the counties that voted for or against. I will say the one thing that was, I guess, mildly surprising is that swing voters in purple places in California also came down on the side of Prop 50.
So once again, do you look at that as an up-down vote on Trump's rule?
I do. I think it was very much an up-down vote on what is a completely blatant, naked attempt to essentially steal an election by having politicians choose their voters rather than the other way around.
For our next question, I asked our guests about the signals this election highlighted for the country and for the West Coast. Sandeep Kaushik chimed in.
Well, here's what the biggest one, probably the biggest takeaway. It was a really great night for Democrats across the board, right? We were winning all those races. There was polling in some sense, particularly after November of 24, that in states like New Jersey, Trump was making real inroads with voters there, and that this gubernatorial race might end up being quite close, if not an upset for the Republicans. Instead, Cheryl's winning by double digits. I mean, it's a blowout win, right? And so I think my biggest takeaway is that the anti-Trump energy in the Democratic Party is a fast rising tide, right? And the kind of excesses and ideological radicalism and abuses and the authoritarian abuses of the Trump administration are starting to spark a backlash among voters, right? Including, we're seeing some of those same demographics that moved sharply to Trump in 2024 in this last election came back into the Democratic column. That's a good sign. I also think there's a lot of frustration still around for normie voters with the economy. And Trump made big promises running last year that as soon as he got elected, prices are going to come down and everything's going to be affordable again. And instead, none of that has happened. Instead, he's taken a series of actions that look like they're driving prices up, like his kind of what I call his monarchical capitalistic tariff regime and things like that. So I think frustration, his approval numbers are sinking. I think frustration with the excesses of his administration are growing. Energy on the Democratic side is rising. And that all portends right now quite well for Democrats in the 2026 midterm.
For all the talk that Trump put into cultural issues, it seemed to me like the prevailing message was about the economy and affordability and inflation. And obviously he's been disappointing in that regard. Do you agree with the view that the key message that's coming out of this election cycle, and maybe from 2024 as well, is affordability? And if so, how can candidates on the West Coast and nationally really drive that home, not just in words, but in deed?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the economy and really people sense that their ability to make ends meet, right? The affordability question. We weren't casting it in terms of affordability last year, but that was clearly a major subtext of last year's election. And now it's very much front and center in this year's elections, whether it's in these local mayoral races where Mamdani or Katie Wilson both put affordability at the center, at the center of their campaigns, and a critique of the establishment having failed to address these problems, or whether it was in these gubernatorial races and pointing the finger at Trump for failing to address or meet the affordability concerns of middle class voters, right? In states like New Jersey and Virginia, it is really front and center. And in the West Coast context, I think we're living in high cost of living states, right? And particularly blue cities, whether it's Seattle or San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, like these. I mean, I can just tell you from the Seattle experience, the cost of living here is really high, right? Maybe 35 to 40% higher than maybe I don't know if it's the national average, but certainly like many other places around the country. So it's not a huge surprise in that kind of context when rents are high and rising, when the cost of groceries has gone up a lot, and there are increasing job losses too, right, that are making people insecure about the economy and the future. Obviously, all of this roiling of the global trade regime by Trump with his tariff stuff. I do think people are nervous about their own economic well-being and their future economic security, and that is front and center. In fact, in some of like in the Virginia gubernatorial race, the Republican candidate really tried to lean hard into the culture war issues, like ran ads about trans women in sports and stuff like that, which did play a significant role in Trump's win last year, but really seemed to have fallen flat in that gubernatorial race this year because Abigail Spanberger was like, what? Like, I'm here talking about the economy and, making the cost of living better for ordinary Virginians and, and voters seem to have responded to that message and not to the culture, seem to kind of put the culture war stuff aside. So here in the West Coast stuff, I think we have real affordability questions. And Seattle is an outlier here because Seattle continues to grow, but cities like San Francisco have been losing population, right? And states like California people are voting with their feet and they're moving to other places, often red states with lower cost of living, which, as we talked about last time I was on your podcast, we're headed for a real electoral college redistricting problem on the Democratic side if those trends continue for very much longer. So anyway.
Super interesting, by the way, to see Gavin Newsom on his Prop 50 victory tour go to where? Texas. And I kind of wonder if there's something they've detected in the shifting demographics of Texas as Californians move there to find affordable houses.
Well, this is something that people on the Democratic side have been predicting for a while, that Texas is going to turn into a purple state so far. And, there have been some relatively close, like there was Senate races that are decided by, 4 or 5 point kind of races but Texas is still a red state, right? I mean, I don't think there's a single Democratic statewide office holder in Texas, nor has there been in probably, God, I don't know how long it's been, a couple decades now. I would say this, there are a lot of people from California moving there. That is true, but it tends to be self-selective, right? A lot of people that are moving out are maybe not, the most ardently progressive sort of blue city kind of types. And they're kind of more, maybe if they're not conservative, they're just people that are no less ideological and moving because they're chasing a lower cost of living. And therefore they're not going to be like some kind of, the tip of the spear of some kind of huge blue wave, I don't think. That said, I mean, the biggest move in this last election is in the Latino vote, right? I mean, what we saw in the presidential last year is really significant movement of Latino men, particularly working class Latino men, non-college educated Latino men, to Trump and the Republican Party. And in this election, we've seen a kind of strong move back to the Democratic side, which is what that's telling us is that those voters, for all the talk of Republicans saying that they're building a durable, multi-ethnic working class coalition, that is at best a way premature argument that Latinos right now are looking much more like swing voters than they are like base Republican voters.
Well, and it turns out that deploying federal agents to Latino communities, citizens are not a terrible strategy.
Yeah. Look, over the last 8 or 10 years or so, I think Democrats badly misunderstood and misread Latino communities and what motivates them, which tend to be much more these bread and butter economic issues, cost of living, affordability, and stuff. And instead, Democrats tried to pander them on, open border kind of stuff. And we're going to be, very, very pro immigration, including undocumented, immigration. And guess what? Particularly in like border communities, a lot of Latino voters, right? American citizens, were not in favor of mass migration and, throwing the borders open and having, hundreds of thousands of people crossing on a, if not millions on an annual basis. This was happening during the Biden administration. The Texas border, those counties flipped from blue to red because of the immigration issue, because Democrats screwed it up. So, which is to say that I think that Trump had a real opportunity. He had a kind of 2-to-1 advantage on the issue of immigration when he came into office, and he squandered that already. Not because people don't want stricter border enforcement or, more of an effort to kind of control immigration rather than allowing kind of uncontrolled mass migration, but because they pushed it so far. I mean, and into these sort of ways that seem not just pro, border control, but actually anti-immigrant and authoritarian. And, the masked ICE agents, the cruel behavior of some of these raids and the way they're conducting them, the rhetoric around some of this stuff coming out of Trump and others in his orbit, I do think has been a wake-up call for a lot of Latino voters that might have voted for him a year ago and saying, this is not what we signed up for. We're okay with border controls. We're not okay with being, hateful or cruel. People who haven't done anything wrong, right? Other than may perhaps cross the border illegally at some point.
Then Mark Fiore had this to say about the implications of the election for the country and the West Coast.
I guess the things that I'm watching out for, I mean, I hope what happened during the 2025 elections, bode well for what's coming in 2026. But I mean, honestly, in a more pessimistic outlook, what I'm watching out for are more corrupt and scary and, insightful things that are going to be coming from Trump and the Republicans. That's honestly what frightens me more. What are they going to try and pull?
And Ashley Brown and I got in a good chat about where things could head in 2026.
I think a lot of proverbial ink has been spilled about the House, mostly because it's been in the news. The Republican majority in the House is razor thin. By the way, is going to get even smaller when Marjorie Taylor Greene leaves office on January the 5th. A lot of talk has been done about, are the Democrats going to retake the House? Consensus is probably what that majority will look like. To me, what's more consequential and what is sort of flying under the radar is the Senate. Sort of conventional wisdom is that the Senate's out of reach. It would require sort of a miracle clean sweep. But when you look at the map, to me, it's not that remote. I mean, you have potentially two good candidates in Maine. Susan Collins is vulnerable. She always has a close race, but Janet Mills is going to be if Janet Mills is the candidate, is the former governor of Maine, that's going to be a formidable race. Ohio is not as much a lost cause as some people perceive. Sherrod Brown, former senator who's held a Senate seat before, he's back to reclaim it. And in a Democratic wave year, Ohio is not so Republican that it would be out of reach. And then I think the dark horse is Alaska, because it's quite likely that Mary Peltola will be the Democratic nominee for the Senate seat in Alaska. She was the former member of the House from Alaska. Of course, only sends one representative to Congress. So she's won statewide in Alaska 3 times. This Senate run will be her 4th. And, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that a majority of Alaskans could send Mary Peltola back to Washington.
So project forward. Let's say it's a very good election for Democrats in the House and the Senate. What's the implication of that?
Oh, well, if the Democrats are able to take the House and the Senate, it's not out of the realm of possibility you could see an impeachment of the president again. What would be really interesting is potentially, and this is sort of a if the Democrats got everything under the Christmas tree in 2026, they could conceivably impeach both President Trump and the vice president.
And, I mean, I think we learned last time, though, that impeachment only goes so far. It takes a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate to actually convict, or even more, to convict a president or any elected official that results in their being removed from office. So, does impeachment matter?
Probably the answer is probably not. But is there a scenario where, the House does at least to put a stake in the ground and mark history, impeach him again? I mean, there's certainly any number of grounds to do so. And I think a lot of it depends on how the next 6 months play out. The Epstein files are not going away as much as the president wants them to. What are in them? If you're totally innocent, you don't do this much work to keep them quiet. I think how the economy goes is going to be really, really crucial. I think it's highly likely the president's tariffs are going to be struck down because they were put in place, through what I think is absolutely presidential overreach. Do we go to war to try to affect regime change in Venezuela? You don't put the largest worship in the world in a carrier group there indefinitely. Something has to happen there. So I think the next 6 months are going to be really interesting to shape what the sort of the twilight of the Trump presidency looks like. I don't know if you would agree with this, but he feels very lame ducky, much earlier than I would have expected.
I'm certainly seeing that thread of discussion. I feel like I have learned over the last 10 years not to underestimate Donald Trump and his movement, nor to expect that learning will necessarily happen, that he would pivot, even though he seems to have embraced Zohran Mamdani, that, he's going to shift his politics. It feels like when things are stacked against Donald Trump, he gets worse. And so what I worry about is, yes, this will add fuel to the fire on an invasion of Venezuela that seems motivated maybe by regime change, sort of dubiously about drug intervention, and maybe mostly about Venezuelan oil. That feels like a really destabilizing move for our hemisphere and a continuation of his blatant discrimination against people who speak Spanish. I'm concerned that we haven't seen the worst yet.
I'll pick up the thread about intervention in Latin America. 150 years of American history tells us that when we intervene in Latin America and try to affect regime change, it almost never ends very well for us.
Yeah, that is my worry. I mean, I think what you're saying is if it's a very good election in the Senate and the House for Democrats, the legislative agenda of Donald Trump, to the extent that's mattered to this presidency, will grind to a halt. But I think there's a bunch of other related projections we might make for an upcoming discussion about 2027.
Well, and I want to just sort of highlight, it's not just about the legislative agenda grinding to a halt. That certainly would happen. But it also gives the Democrats the power to investigate and subpoena. And I think when and if Democrats retake the House and or the Senate, you're going to see a raft of investigations and hearings like I don't think we've experienced before.
Yeah, and I will say that part worries me because while a Nuremberg-like trial seems well justified given the gross offenses against the rule of law and the Constitution that this administration has perpetrated, I feel like the American public's patience for that kind of legislative activity is pretty slim. And that in the meantime, real problems like affordability related to housing, like healthcare, like the decline of American education, those issues just carry on. I'd be looking for the Democrats to figure out how to hold the Republicans accountable and also shift more and more and more attention to the actual problems that are pocketbook issues for most Americans.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The tariff regime, the longer it stays in place, the more inflationary it becomes. And this is going to increasingly be, I think, a very difficult topic for congressional Republicans to stick to the message.
For our last question, I asked, what are your nightmare and dream scenarios for 2026? Ashley Brown started us off.
The nightmare would be that the Democrats fail to retake either chamber, and thus we have 2 more years of sort of an unchecked president, who then really is also a lame duck in the truest sense of the word. I also fear that he might get another Supreme Court appointment. I could see, if the Democrats don't retake the Senate, Alito or Thomas either dying or choosing to retire, which could potentially give Trump 1 or 2 more SCOTUS appointments. I think that's my nightmare scenario. My dream scenario is that they retake both the House and the Senate. And to your point, Trump's legislative agenda largely grinds to a halt. I then also hope that the court strike down the tariff regime, which I think is probably permanently damaged the United States' standing in the world for the rest of our lifetime. And I think generationally damaged what was an excellent relationship with Canada. Our relationship with Canada, I think, is one of the most undercovered topics right now. Not only are Canadians livid that we have essentially broken our promises and our commitments to them, but we have a U.S. ambassador in Canada, Pete Hoekstra, who is incredibly loud and bombastic and very insulting to Canadians. When you go to Canada, this is the relationship with the United States and the tariff regime is, and how Canada is going to respond to that and completely reorient their economy away from North American integration is the story. And once you reorient the world's 5th largest economy away from North American integration, it doesn't come back.
Yes, it does. It does seem like Canada's taken this as a chance to realign its interests with those of Western Europe in particular.
And North American integration has been the single largest driver of prosperity since the 1990s. And the long-term effects of decoupling the US and Canadian economies, it's going to take years for that to show. But when it does show, it's going to be very damaging to us.
There is a long-term trend to watch, which is whether Donald Trump's moves have doomed the United States to a path that looks like that of Great Britain, a kind of once great world power that, is now an important but relatively feeble player on the world stage, that we've isolated ourselves as opposed to made ourselves a leader. Sandeep Kaushik had this to say.
I was just talking to a friend at the D-Trip, the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. They're the arm of the Democratic caucus in the House in Congress that runs and organizes the national congressional campaign effort. And they remain cautiously optimistic that they're going to take back the House in 2026, even with all of this, mid-decade redistricting stuff that's going on, where it is probably fairly likely when the dust settles on all of that Republicans basically by, if not outright cheating, by trying to rejigger the rules and put their thumb on the scale. I mean, basically, they're trying to redraw district lines to advantage themselves. It's pretty obvious. And now Democrats are responding, and it's turned into a kind of tit for tat total war on redistricting around the country. And I do think Republicans will, when the dust settles, will gain some advantage out of that. Maybe a net 5, maybe even 10 seats. We'll see. A lot of these districts that they're redrawing the lines on, they're doing it based on the 2024 turnouts. And, like I said, some of these constituencies, like Latino voters in the Texas border South, may not be in a mood to vote for Republicans this time the way they were last year. So some of those districts may not actually end up being red districts, even though they're trying to draw them to be. So we'll see how that plays. But even with that advantage, I think Democrats, look, if Democrats don't take back the House of Representatives next year, then it is a 5-alarm fire in the Democratic Party. At that point, especially after this election cycle and the success Democrats have had, if we can't keep that momentum going and take back the House, man, all hell's going to break loose at that point. And then the Senate is a real challenge for Democrats. Again, I think this is something Ezra Klein pointed out in that piece, but he's absolutely right to put a focus on this. In 24 states, Donald Trump last year won by 10 points or more. Almost half the Senate seems almost out of play for Democrats just right off the bat, right? Making up a 10-point gap is huge. So that makes the Democratic Party has to figure out how to become competitive again in large swaths of the country where the party's ability to win has eroded enormously over the last 10 years. As the party has largely, I think, because as the party has moved left, not just ideologically but culturally, it's losing to the point of this podcast. We've become a little too West Coast or Blue City, and that's not playing well in Peoria, right? Like culturally, that's got to be something that we've got to figure out. And we'll see how we do in these Senate races. There's an opportunity in Maine, like I said, a hot race in Michigan, like Sherrod Brown, who lost his Senate seat in Ohio. Ohio's a tough one, right? I mean, Ohio's now a red state, but we had a Sherrod Brown, a sitting U.S. senator there until last year, right? So can we take that back? So places like that I'm going to be watching too.
What also seems clear is when Donald Trump is on the ballot, he gets people out to vote who wouldn't otherwise. So
well, he drives turnout on both sides, right? Like I mean, look at that 2020 race where enormous turnout. I mean, he turned out 75 million people voted Republican, which was way more than in 2016. It's just that 80 million people turned out on the Democratic side, right, in 2020 when Biden got elected. So yeah, he is a polarization machine and he drives turnout.
And Mark Fiore paints a dystopian picture before offering something more utopian.
Dystopian view is that luckily this didn't happen in Berkeley, when I think Turning Point was there recently or something, but there's going to be a place or places where there's small things that are blown up to be even bigger. I mean, like they've done already, in Portland and Chicago. It's like, things are not blissful and perfect in every city across the United States, but what they're going to do and what they've already done is take some small event, and gin that up, just like they did in Washington, D.C., when that guy got beat up. It's like, yes, getting beat up is bad. Violence is bad. But that is not a reason to call in the National Guard. So that's what worries me, is that there's going to be more of that. And where's that going to happen? Is it going to be San Francisco? Is it going to be Seattle? Is it going to, is it West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, or is it going to be a few places? It's like Trump would want nothing more than to have, some truly violent people push back against ICE or against, some guard members that have been put out there. And then, if you want to take that even farther, it's like he just wants an excuse to call in more military or, declare martial law or something ridiculous. So I hope I'm just sounding like a, conspiracy theorist, and I hope I remain that way. But that is my fear, honestly, and something like that happening and then turning things, into an even worse position.
So let's flip that around. What's your utopian vision for this time next year?
Well, I hope the utopian vision is that the Republicans keep stumbling over themselves the way they did with Epstein and, the way they did during the elections and, when Prop 51 in California. I hope some of these wins on the, opposition side keep them flat-footed and keep them blaming each other. Like I want to see more infighting. Let's see more Marjorie Taylor Greene versus Trump. Let's see some of these people starting to see that the emperor has no clothes, or let's see more Republicans look at Trump and be like, well, wait, he's now saying that we don't have the right workers here, so we need to bring them from China. Like, that doesn't sound very MAGA. It's like I want to see them start to fall apart and realize that they are not just scary autocrats, even though they have those tendencies, but that they are a bunch of backwards, people who are not the sharpest tools in the shed. It's like you have those, going back to the basket full of deplorables. It's like, yes, I'm okay with saying that now. There's a lot of those, but then you also have the more devious, insidious people there, like Stephen Miller. And it's like, yeah, you have those guys, but let's just see that. Let's see that for what it is. And hopefully they will see each other for what they are and start, tearing each other apart Meanwhile, people on the opposition side, or Democrats, or whatever you want to call them, are going to be having successes. So I guess that's the more rosy picture that I would love to see.
Lastly, I asked each of our guests to write a November 2026 headline that they could already imagine. Ashley Brown started us off.
Headline would be Democrats sweep House, Senate, state houses. It's the beginning of the end of our national nightmare, says Speaker-elect Hakeem Jeffries.
Sandeep Kaushik expanded.
Blue wave sweeps America. That's the optimistic headline.
And in Mark Fiore's case, I asked him to anticipate a cartoon he'd draw in November of 2026.
There's always the Dewey defeats Truman cartoon. It's, Trump defeats Trump, Epstein defeats Trump, whatever, there's something along those lines where it's hopefully a happy story. But, again, it's like this is a different discussion probably, but from the position of drawing a cartoon or creating a piece of satire, it's always harder to create something that's around a positive event. So as a citizen, what I hope for are good things to happen, like we've been talking about. I would love for good things to happen. But as a cartoonist and as a satirist, it's always easier to attack. And the cartoon is always stronger when you're showing who's the hypocrite, who's the villain. Those are the stronger, more powerful cartoons when you're more pissed off. The cartoons about like, rah, rah, wasn't that great? Those tend to be the weaker cartoons. But obviously, as a citizen, that's what I want.
So I'm hoping that you're out of material this time next year.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Hopefully I'm out of material and instead I'm just, celebrating, and everybody's partying in the streets because we narrowly averted an autocratic society.
Through these conversations with Ashley, Mark, and Sandeep, a few things came clear. The just completed 2025 elections offered hopeful signs for believers in American democracy. As always, pocketbook issues move voters, and the Trump administration has its hands in our pockets. West Coast politics are alive, new groups and new ideas are circulating, and the fight for democracy and for West Coast interests is not settled. It's intensifying heading into next year. So as always, this has me asking lots of other questions. Donald Trump's handlers have to recognize that their window for entrenching a truly terrible agenda may be drawing short if Democrats take the House and Senate in 2026. Will the Trump people go for broke, be damned their popularity? Could we see their attempts to suppress the popular vote shift into overdrive? Could we see the unwanted and unnecessary federal occupation of big cities intensify? And will they continue to make an example of the West Coast? And will people on the West Coast in frog costumes, hilariously smart protests, and at the ballot box become more defiant? More questions. Will the young progressives taking over in big cities like New York and Seattle show that not only can they campaign in poetry, but they can govern in ways that put real progress in their progressive messages? And as Gavin Newsom reaches his term limit as governor of California and sets his sights on running for president, as Nancy Pelosi steps aside from a storied career in Congress, will the next governor of our biggest state and future congressional leaders from San Francisco be made for media or pragmatists committed to solving West Coast problems like affordability? Can we walk the talk on making our region, our states, and our cities the envy of the country and the world? So here's my question to you. What headline do you want to read in November 2026? And what are you willing to do now to help write it? Please subscribe, like, and share, and most importantly, comment on YouTube at Pacific Time Podcast. Thanks for being with me in Pacific Time. I can't wait to continue the conversation.